This show has spent a lot of time holding the left accountable. We've documented the protest industrial complex. We've covered the school systems teaching children that federal law enforcement agents are kidnappers. We've called out the Democrats who filed war power resolutions while American soldiers were in combat. We have named the professors who celebrated a man's murder. We have covered the border failures, the Iranian sleeper cell threat, the gender ideology capture of medicine and education, the abortion industry, and the systematic dismantling of the institutions that hold American civilization together. I do it all because it's true, and because it needs to be said, and because the mainstream media will not say it. Not Clinton News Network, not misinformation spread by narcissists, brainwashing credulous, and not even followers of xenophobia. But this show made a promise. Not an explicit one. I've never stood in front of a microphone and recited it, but it is embedded in every episode that I've produced. In the decision to call out the Loudoun County School Board, the Columbia administration, the Notre Dame administration, the Albany legislature, the Hollywood establishment, the academic freedom frauds, the promise is this: I go where the truth goes. I hold power accountable, regardless of what team it's on. And I don't give a Republican a pass on government overreach just because they're on the right side of the border debate. Tonight, that promise gets tested. Tonight, I'm talking about Tennessee again, and I'm talking about Tennessee not as an enemy, but as a state that this show has reason to care about. A state with genuine conservative values, genuine faith traditions, genuine communities of working people who deserve a government that serves their interests, rather than one that has decided government knows best, regardless of which party is operating it. The Tennessee Republican legislature has been busy. They have introduced a bill that would create a de facto registry of transgender patients, a database of people's private medical information tied to their age, county, and prescriptions, posted publicly by the state. They passed a law effective January 1st of this year, authorizing law enforcement to use reasonable force to obtain blood samples from DUI suspects once a warrant is obtained. They have no comprehensive law preventing mugshot publishing websites from plastering arrest photos across the internet before a single conviction has been obtained. They provide no mandated paid family leave for private sector workers, leaving Tennessee families among the most poorly protected in the country when a child is born or a family member falls ill. And the state has a documented culture of treating arrested people as guilty before any court has said so, in ways that damage lives and livelihoods permanently. Every one of those things should make a genuine conservative angry, not because conservatives have abandoned their principles, but because these policies are a betrayal of those principles. Limited government, individual liberty, privacy rights, the presumption of innocence, the family as the foundational unit of society. These are conservative values. The Tennessee legislature is violating them. And the people who call themselves conservatives in that legislature need to hear from the people they represent. I am one of those people, and I'm not going to stay silent because the offenders are wearing the right jersey.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
Let me be clear about something before a single word of analysis is offered, because this show owes its audience honesty about where it stands before it asks them to follow an argument. This show has been critical of gender ideology in education. I've covered the Fort Bragg kindergarten classroom. I've covered the Loudoun County locker room case. I've covered the Utah compelled speech bill and the school counselors participating in anti-ICE walkouts and the systematic capture of educational institutions by an ideology that wants to reshape children's identities without parental consent. I believe that gender ideology, as it is being deployed in schools and pediatric medicine and public policy, is causing real harm to children. I've said so, and I'm going to keep saying so. But there's a difference, a fundamental, principled, non-negotiable difference between opposing the institutional imposition of gender ideology on children and children's families, and supporting a government program that compiles and publicly posts the medical records of adults who have made private healthcare decisions about their own bodies and their own lives. The first is a defense of parental rights and institutional accountability. The second is government surveillance of private citizens for the purpose of making their medical decisions visible to the public. Those are not the same thing. Anyone who says they are the same thing is not applying a consistent principle. They are applying a targeted one. House bill introduced by Representative Jeremy Faison and Senator Brent Taylor would require gender clinics to report patient statistics to the Tennessee Department of Health every month for public posting. The data includes age, sex, county of residence, and medications prescribed. The bill says the data must not contain individually identifiable health information. The sponsors say it does not violate HIPAA. The HIPAA argument deserves examination before it's accepted. Under the safe harbor method of the HIPAA privacy rule, de-identification requires the removal of all geographic subdivisions smaller than a state, including county. The bill requires county to be included. The sponsors are arguing that the combination of data fields, age, sex, county, medications, does not constitute individually identifiable information. Dayron Annalise Johnson of Tennessee Equality Project raised the specific concern that in small rural communities where the number of patients receiving gender-related care at a specific provider may be very small, the combination of those fields is sufficient to re-identify specific individuals. In a county with 3 or 4 patients receiving a specific medication from a specific gender clinic, the published data effectively identifies those patients to anyone in the community who chooses to look. Now here is the question that every genuine conservative should be asking. What business does the Tennessee state government have posting the medical records, even aggregated, even anonymized, even with the best de-identification efforts the sponsors can devise, of its private citizens on a public website? Representative Faison said the goal is to collect data and track the trend. He said transition surgeries have impacted his constituents, and he thinks it's important to see the numbers and the trends. That's a policy curiosity, not a government function. The state of Tennessee wanting to know how many people are receiving gender-related medical care in each county so it can track the trend is the state of Tennessee deciding that its citizens' medical decisions are a matter of public interest that the government is entitled to monitor and publish. Under what principle of limited government does that authority exist? The answer is none. There is no limited government principle that supports a state government compiling and publicly posting data about the specific medical treatments of its citizens are receiving, even in aggregate form, even without names attached. The government that is authorized to know what medications you are taking and post that information publicly, even without your name, is not a limited government. It's a surveillance state operating in the same name of conservative values. The requirement that insurance companies covering gender transition surgery must also cover gender detransition surgery. That is a different matter entirely and a legitimate policy argument. The principle that if you're going to mandate coverage for a medical pathway, you must mandate coverage for its reversal is a coherent application of equal treatment. I don't object to that provision. I object to the medical registry that the bill creates alongside of it. Faison says the intent is not to cause harm or target individuals. We take him at his word on his intent, but government overreach does not require malicious intent to produce harmful outcomes. The road to surveillance state is paved with data collection efforts that seem reasonable in isolation, justified by policy curiosity, defended as non-identifying, and deployed by future administrations in a way that the original sponsors never intended and can't control once the infrastructure exists. The conservative movement has spent 50 years arguing that the government should not be trusted with more information about its citizens than it strictly needs to perform its legitimate functions. The Tennessee Transgender Data Bill is a Republican legislature building exactly the kind of government surveillance infrastructure that conservatism exists to prevent, on a population that is easy to target because of its social profile, which makes it more dangerous, not less. If you believe that adults have the right to make their own medical decisions without government interference, then the state of Tennessee creating a public database of which medical decisions and its citizens are making is a violation of that right. Full stop. The fact that the medical decisions in question are the ones you may disagree with does not change the principle. If the principle only applies to medical decisions that you approve of, it's not a principle, it's a preference. And a government that builds surveillance infrastructure to track the medical preferences it disapproves of is a government that will eventually track yours. Also on January 1st of this year, a new Tennessee law went into effect authorizing law enforcement officers to assist medical practitioners in using reasonable force to obtain blood samples from DUI suspects once a search warrant was obtained. Let's be honest about what that phrase, reasonable force, means in practice. It means that if you are a Tennessee resident who has been pulled over on suspicion of DUI and you refuse the consent to a blood draw and law enforcement obtains a warrant, law enforcement can now physically restrain you while a needle is inserted into your arm and your blood is extracted without your consent by force. That is what the law authorizes. The warrant requirement is important. It distinguishes this from warrantless forced blood draws that the Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional. But the warrant does not change the fundamental nature of what is happening. The state of Tennessee is authorizing the physical invasion of a citizen's body, the forcible penetration of the skin, and taking of a biological sample over the citizen's explicit objection. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Their persons, not just their homes, not just their papers, their persons. The Supreme Court has held that blood draws are searches under the Fourth Amendment, and that the highly invasive nature of the procedure requires a warrant. Tennessee's new law threads that needle by requiring the warrant. But the conservative principle at stake here is not just the warrant requirement. It's the question of whether the state should be authorized to physically penetrate a citizen's body by force. The arguments for this law are not trivial. DUI kills people. Accurate BAC evidence is more reliable than breath tests. Drug-impaired drivers cannot be detected by a breathalyzer. Protecting innocent people from drunk and drugged drivers is a legitimate government function. These are real arguments, and they deserve acknowledgement. The question is whether those arguments are sufficient to authorize the physical invasion of a person's body against their will, even with judicial authorization. There are people who believe they are. There are people who believe no government interest is sufficient to justify that specific physical violation. That is a serious constitutional and moral debate. What is not a serious position is the claim that this is obviously acceptable policy because it requires a warrant. The warrant requirement is the floor, not the ceiling, of the Fourth Amendment protection. A state can require more of itself than the constitutional minimum. Tennessee chose not to. Tennessee chose instead to arm its officers with the explicit statutory authorization to physically restrain citizens and forcibly insert needles into their arms with a judge's signature. In the same legislative session where Tennessee Republicans are being appropriately praised for pushing back against federal overreach, against government mandates, against the Progressive Project's expansion of state power over individual lives, they passed a law giving the government the power to pierce your skin by force. The parallel to the left's approach to individual rights is not subtle. The Progressive Project has spent years arguing that individual rights must yield a collective safety, that the right to keep and bear arms must yield to gun violence statistics, that the right to free speech must yield to the harm it causes, that parental rights must yield to the state's assessment of children's best interests. The conservative response to every one of those arguments has been individual rights are not subject to majority override based on policy outcomes. The right exists because the government is not trusted with the power its absence would confer. The principle does not have an exception for DUI enforcement. Either the individual's right to be free from non-consensual physical invasion by the state is a real right, or it's not. The Tennessee Republicans just voted that it's not. As long as the government has a compelling enough reason and the judge's approval, the practical concerns compound the constitutional ones. The reasonable force standard is not self-defining. What force is reasonable when a person is actively resisting a blood draw? Physical restraint by multiple officers? The use of restraining equipment? At what point does the reasonable force used to obtain a blood sample become an excessive force claim? These are not hypothetical questions. They're the questions that'll be litigated in Tennessee courts for years as the law is applied in the field by officers making real-time judgments about how much force the extraction of blood sample requires. The people who bear the cost of those judgment calls, who are restrained, who are held down, who are punctured by force, will not at all be guilty of DUI. Some of them will have their charges dismissed. Some of them will be acquitted. And the forced blood draw that was authorized by a warrant based on probable cause that turned out to be incorrect will leave no legal remedy for the physical invasion of their body that the state authorized. Tennessee Republicans should repeal this provision. The DUI enforcement interests can be served by warrant-based blood draws that do not include statutory authorization for forcible extraction. The additional deterrent value of the force provision does not justify the constitutional and human dignity costs it imposes. The United States Constitution guarantees the presumption of innocence. You are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. We all know that's bullshit, and that's the principle, and it's not a technicality. It's the foundational protection of individual liberty in a system where the government has the power to arrest, prosecute, and incarcerate its citizens. Without the presumption of innocence, the arrest is the punishment, because the consequences of being arrested flow immediately, before any adjudication, before any finding of fact, before any opportunity to contest the charges. Tennessee has no comprehensive law protecting its citizens from mugshot publication. When you are arrested in Tennessee, your booking photo becomes part of the public record. County sheriff's offices post booking reports online as a matter of routine. Third-party websites scrape those records, publish the mugshots, and in many documented cases, charge fees to remove them. A practice that amounts to extortion of people who have been arrested but not convicted, who are entitled to be presumed innocent, but whose faces and names and charges are available to any employer, landlord, neighbor, or family member who types their name into a search engine. The consequences are not abstract. An employer searching a job applicant's name finds a mugshot from an arrest 2 years ago. Charges that were later dismissed, but the mugshot remains because Tennessee law does not require its removal, and the website that posted it has no obligation to take it down. A landlord searching for a rental applicant, and he finds the same image. A parent searching a child's new friend finds it. A romantic partner finds it. In each of those cases, the person seeing the mugshot does not see the subsequent dismissal. They see the arrest. They draw the conclusion the image invites. And the presumption of innocence that the Constitution guarantees is rendered practically meaningless by the combination of public records law, commercial exploitation to those records, and the state's decision to not intervene. Nashville has had a publication called Busted, a mugshot magazine that has circulated arrest photos for commercial profit. Some Tennessee newspapers publish mugshot roundups from weekly arrest reports. The Nashville Police Department has, at documented points, published photos of people arrested in prostitution stings explicitly for the purpose of public shaming. That last practice is worth sitting with for a moment. A government law enforcement agency using public resources, publishing the photos of people who have been arrested but not convicted of any crime for the stated purpose of shaming them into compliance with the law. The government is running a shaming operation against its own citizens before any court has found them guilty of anything. The conservative argument against this is the same conservative argument that should be made against every government outreach or overreach. The state does not have the right to punish citizens it is not convicted. An arrest is a legal procedure, not a conviction. The power to arrest is not the power to punish. A government that publishes its citizens' faces in criminal charges as a deliberate deterrent before trial, before conviction, before any judicial finding is using the arrest as punishment in violation of the due process principles that limited government conservatism has always been committed to protecting. Some will argue that public records transparency requires the free flow of arrest information. That argument has real merit in specific contexts. The accountability of law enforcement, the public interest in knowing about arrests of public officials, the transparency of the criminal justice process. None of those legitimate interests require the commercial exploitation of arrest photos by for-profit mugshot websites or the deliberate government publication of arrest images for shaming purposes. The transparency of interest can be served without the destruction of individuals who are arrested, never convicted, and whose lives are permanently damaged by the digital permanence of a booking photo that the legal system ultimately determined was not evidence of guilt. Tennessee Republicans should pass a comprehensive mugshot protection law. It should require the removal of arrest photos from commercial websites when charges are dismissed or the person is acquitted. It should prohibit government agencies from publishing arrest photos for deterrent or shaming purposes. It should create an expedited process for expungement that actually results in removal from the digital record, not just from government databases. That's not a radical proposal. Multiple other states have enacted or considered or are considering similar protections. Tennessee's failure to do so is a failure of conservative principle that the government should not be in the business of punishing people it has not convicted. Here's something that the Republican Party's political consultants do not want to acknowledge because the acknowledgement is uncomfortable. There is a significant population of working-class Americans, exactly the people the Republican Party claims to represent, exactly the people who put Donald Trump in the White House in 2024, whose lives are materially harder because their state governments have decided that paid family leave is a progressive policy that conservative governance should oppose. Tennessee has no mandated paid family leave for private sector workers. A woman who works at a restaurant, a factory, a retail store, a small business, who gives birth to a child in Tennessee is entitled, under federal law, to 12 weeks of unpaid, job-protected leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act. If her employer has 50 or more employees and she's worked there for at least 12 months, 12 weeks unpaid, meaning she must either return to work before her body is recovered from childbirth and before her infant has had the developmental foundation of the early weeks with a present parent, or she must go without her paycheck during those weeks. For a family living paycheck to paycheck, which describes the majority of working class families in Tennessee, going without a paycheck for 12 weeks is not a choice. It's an impossibility. Tennessee state employers received 6 weeks of paid parental leave in 2023, and the legislature expanded that to include end-of-life caregiving in 2026. Good. That is a step in the right direction for the people it covers. It covers state employees. It covers nobody working in the private sector. The restaurant workers, the factory workers, the retail employees, the small business employees, the people the Republican Party tells every election cycle are the backbone of American economy, and the people the government should be fighting for. The argument against mandated paid family leave from the small government conservative perspective is familiar. It is an employer mandate. It imposes cost on small businesses. It interferes with the free market relationship between employer and employee. Those arguments have merit in specific contexts, and they deserve serious engagement. But serious engagement requires acknowledging their limits, and their limit in the paid family leave debate is this: the absence of mandated paid family leave is not a neutral market outcome. It's a policy choice that transfers the cost of childbearing and family caregiving from employers to the working families who can least afford to bear it. The working class woman who returns to work 3 weeks after giving birth because her family can't survive without her paycheck is not exercising a free market preference. She is bearing a cost that her employer is not required to share. In a state that has decided that the market arrangement, however unfavorable to her, is preferable to any government intervention. Conservatism at its best has always been about the family. Not the family as an abstraction in a political speech. The family as the specific, concrete, irreplaceable institution that raises children, transmits values, provides stability, and does the work that no government program can replicate. If the family is the foundational unit of a healthy society, and this show believes that it is, then policies that make it harder for families to form, harder for mothers to bond with newborns, harder for fathers to be present in the early weeks of a child's life, harder for working people to care for aging parents without losing their income. Those policies are not conservative. They are indifferent to the specific human reality that conservatism claims to be protecting. Tennessee is not the only state in this position. Most southern states lag on paid family leave protections for private sector workers. The comparison is not to California or New York, whose mandated leave programs come embedded in progressive policy packages that impose other significant costs on employers and workers. The comparison is to what working families in Tennessee actually need: the ability to have a child without choosing between their baby's welfare and their family's financial survival. That is not a progressive ask. It's a human one, and a conservative political movement that cannot find a way to address it, though tax incentives to employers through state-level family leave funds, through any mechanism that reflects the value the movement claims to place on family formation, is a movement that has confused its resistance to progressive policy mechanisms with indifference to the human outcomes those mechanisms are designed to address. Tennessee Republicans should be leading on this, not by importing the California model, by designing a Tennessee model, one that reflects conservative values of family, work, and limited government intervention while actually producing outcomes that benefit the working families of Tennessee rather than leaving them to navigate childbirth and family crisis on their own with no financial floor beneath them. The 4 specific issues this episode has addressed, the transgender data registry, the forced blood draws, the mugshot shaming, and the paid family leave failure, are not random collection of Tennessee grievances. They are examples of a pattern that is visible in Republican-governed states across the country. And that pattern has a name: the exercise of government power in ways that betray the principles the party claims to govern by. Limited government conservatism has a clear, coherent content. Government should do less, not more. Individual liberty should be protected from government intrusion, not managed by government programs. Privacy is a fundamental right that the government must respect, rather than a preference that government may override when it has sufficiently compelling reason. The presumption of innocence is not a technicality, but a foundational protection against the abuse of government power. Families are better positioned than government to make decisions about their own lives, their own medical care, their own values, their own children. These principles have been articulated by conservative thinkers, politicians, and movement leaders for 100 years. They are not controversial within the conservative tradition. They are the tradition. The Tennessee legislature introduced a bill to build a public database of its citizens' medical decisions. That's not limited government. The Tennessee legislature authorized officers to forcibly extract blood from citizens' bodies. That's not protection of individual liberty from government intrusion. Tennessee legislature has not protected its citizens from the commercial exploitation of their arrest photos before conviction. That's not the presumption of innocence in practice. The Tennessee legislature has not ensured that working families can have children without financial crisis. That's not putting families first. The question this episode asks of Tennessee Republican legislature, and of every Republican legislature that is doing similar things in other states, is, what are you actually conserving? Not rhetorically, specifically. What is the governing philosophy that produces a public medical database, a forced blood draw law, no mugshot protection, and no family paid leave in the same legislative session? The answer, when you examine the outputs rather than the rhetoric, looks less like principled limited government conservatism and more like the same thing this show criticizes the left for: the exercise of institutional power for its own sake, justified by whatever argument is convenient in the moment without consistent application of the principles the institution claims to hold. The left does this constantly. It claims to defend individual rights while building the most sophisticated censorship and conformity enforcement machinery in history. It claims to protect the vulnerable while building the administrative structures that produce the Hermantown curricula and the Loudoun County Title IX investigations. It claims to stand for the working people while serving the interest of institutional progressive establishment that has captured every major cultural and economic institution in the country. The left's hypocrisy on these questions is the subject of most of the episodes this show produces. But hypocrisy does not have a party. The Republican Party that claims to protect privacy while building a public medical database is being hypocritical. The Republican Party that claims to protect individual liberty while authorizing forced blood draws is being hypocritical. The Republican Party that claims to stand for the presumption of innocence while allowing the commercial exploitation of arrest photos is being hypocritical. The Republican Party that claims to put families first while leaving working mothers to choose between their paycheck and their newborn is being hypocritical. Naming that hypocrisy is not disloyalty to conservatism. It is the defense of conservatism against the people who are wearing its name while betraying its substance. There is a deeper issue underneath all of this, and it connects to something this show has been saying throughout its entire run. The political class, left and right, Democrat and Republican, Albany and Nashville, is not primarily motivated by the principles it claims to hold. It's motivated by the acquisition and exercise of power, by the donor relationships that fund campaigns and careers, by the institutional incentives that reward the performance of governance over its substance. The Democratic politician who claims to care about working people while building the open border that suppresses their wages is not primarily a hypocrite. They are a person whose actual incentives run in a different direction than their stated values. The Republican politician who claims to care about individual liberty while voting to authorize forced blood draws is not primarily a hypocrite. They are a person whose actual incentives, the law enforcement lobby, the DUI victim and advocacy groups, the political risk of being seen as soft on drunk drivers, ran stronger than the abstract principle of bodily autonomy in the specific moment the vote was taken. We the people are tired of it. That's not a partisan statement. It's a statement about the political class as a class. The people who have turned public service into a career, who treat the offices they hold as assets to be managed for personal and political benefit, who have insulated themselves from the consequences of the policies they impose on the people they represent. The Tennessee legislator who voted for the forced blood draw law has excellent state employee health insurance. The Tennessee state legislator who has not passed paid family leave for private sector workers has state employee paid leave. The Tennessee legislator who has not protected citizens from mugshot exploitation websites is not the person whose face appears in those publications. They legislate from a position of insulation from those consequences of their legislation. Is the fundamental structural problem with the political class, regardless of party. This show will keep saying so. Not to tear down conservatism, to call it back to itself, to the principles that make it worth fighting for, the principles that distinguish it from the left's project of government expansion and individual dependency. Limited government, individual liberty, privacy, the presumption of innocence, the family. These are worth defending. They are worth defending against the left's assault on them. They are also worth defending against the Republican legislature in Nashville that is betraying them in the name of conservative governance. The Tennessee Republican legislature introduced a bill to publicly post its citizens' medical records. It passed a law authorizing the use of physical force to extract blood from the bodies of citizens who have been charged with no crime other than refusing a test. It has not protected its citizens from having their arrest photos commercially exploited before any conviction. It is not ensured that working mothers and fathers can afford to be present for their newborns without losing their income. This show is calling that out, not because Tennessee is the enemy, because Tennessee is better than this. Because the people of Tennessee, the working families, the faith communities, the people who built a state on the values of individual liberty and limited government and personal responsibility and family, deserve a legislature that actually governs by those values rather than wearing them as a costume for the next election cycle. To the Tennessee legislatures who might hear this, we see you. We see what you're doing, and we see the gap between what you say and what you vote for. We are not going to stay quiet about that gap because you have an R next to your name. The forced blood draw law is government overreach. Repeal it. The transgender data registry is a surveillance state proposal. Kill it. The mugshot exploitation of unconvicted citizens is a violation of presumption of innocence. Pass a protection law. The failure to address paid family leave for private sector workers is an abandonment of the working families you claim to represent. Fix it. And to the audience, this is what accountability without tribalism looks like. It's not comfortable. It's not what the partisan media on either side models for us. The left has its outlets that will defend anything a Democrat does and attack anything a Republican does. The right has its outlets that will defend anything a Republican does and attack anything that a Democrat does. This show is neither of those things. This show goes where the truth goes. When the left builds a protest industrial complex that funds the radicalization of campuses and enables Iranian proxy recruitment on American soil, I say so. When the Tennessee Republican legislature builds a medical surveillance database and authorizes officers to restrain citizens and take their blood by force, I say so. The American people are not well served by a political press that only holds one side accountable. They are served by honest people who will call out the abuse of power wherever it lives, whatever jersey it's wearing, whatever excuse it's offering. That is the commitment this show has made. I'm keeping it. We should pray for the leaders of Tennessee to return to the principles they claim to hold. We should pray for the people of Tennessee, the working mothers, the families, the citizens who deserve a government that protects their liberty rather than building new mechanisms to surveil and coerce them. And we should pray for a political class in Nashville and everywhere else that has the integrity to govern by what it believes rather than by what is convenient. Stand with us, support the mission, refuse the silence. Find us at TITDUSA.com and the Stand Against the Silence campaign. I'll see you next time.